Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar, and that means that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I have been doing so for decades. I've been a fan of Tolkien since I first read The Hobbit when I was about 7 or 8 years old, somewhere around there, and a few years later read The Lord of the Rings and just went from there, So I'm, generally speaking, the guy that you can come to with any sort of question about Tolkien. I'm here to answer your questions about Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, or any of his other works, or just him himself. So we're going to get to it in just a moment. Just to give you a brief update on channel stuff, we are at, as of this recording, 1,458 subscribers, so that's pretty great. I mean, just last week I expressed my surprise that we had crested 1,400 so quickly. And now we're more than half of the way from 1,400 to 1,500. So that's 1,500 feels like a significant number. I suppose that no numbers are really more significant than others. I mean, 500 was very significant. 1,000 was very significant because those were clear thresholds on the road to partnership that we've attained full partnership here on YouTube. But beyond that, there's stuff like in the very, very, very distant future, if we even get that far, things like play buttons and that sort of thing. I did get a few YouTube high fives, which is an interesting little program that YouTube partners are in, where they just sort of randomly send out to people. The first one was congratulating me on, I believe, on a certain amount of comments in a period of time, and it was just sort of, hey, you're doing great. And then I got one just the other day about views. And this one actually, not a lot of people know about this program, and I did look into it. This is a legitimate thing that YouTube does. This one had prizes in it, and it was just sort of interesting because I thought, hey, I got another high five, and I'm reading it, and I'm like, wait, this actually has prizes in it. So it had something like free movie tickets and I think a subscription of some sort. I have to look into it further. And something else. So it's pretty cool. I might actually have to look into the movie tickets. I haven't been to the cinema in quite a while. We're going to get to a reading, of course. I decided to read from The Fellowship of the Ring, being the first part of The Lord of the Rings. And I think what I wanted to read was the bit in Book 1 where they first meet Aragorn. Of course, he's Cold Strider at first. The chapter itself is called Strider. All right. Okay. Okay, so this is close enough to it. This part has Gandalf's letter in it, although would we get to the part where they actually read the letter? Yeah, well, okay, here we go. We're going to start here. "Where was I?" said the landlord, pausing and snapping his fingers. "Ah, yes, old Gandalf. 3 months back, he walked right into my room without a knock. 'Barley,' he says, 'I'm off in the morning. Will you do something for me?' 'You've only to name it,' I said. 'I'm in a hurry,' said he, 'and I've no time myself, but I want a message took to the Shire. Have you anyone who can send and trust to go?' 'I can find someone,' I said. 'Tomorrow, maybe, or the day after.' 'Make it tomorrow,' he says, and then he gave me a letter. 'It's addressed plain enough,' said Mr. Butterbur, producing a letter from his pocket and reading out the address slowly and proudly. He valued his reputation as a lettered man. 'Mr. Frodo Baggins, Bag and Hobbiton in the Shire.' 'A letter for me from Gandalf,' cried Frodo. 'Ah,' said Mr. Butterbur, 'then your right name is Baggins.' 'It is,' said Frodo, 'and you'd better give me that letter at once and explain why you never sent it.' 'That's what you came to tell me, I suppose, though you've taken a long time to come to the point.' Poor Mr. Butterbur looked troubled. 'You're right, master,' he said, 'and I beg your pardon. And I'm mortal afraid of what Gandalf will say if harm comes of it. But I didn't keep it back a purpose. I put it by safe. Then I couldn't find nobody willing to go to the Shire next day nor the day after, and none of my own folk were to spare. And then one thing after another drove it out of my mind. I'm a busy man. I'll do what I can to set matters right, and if there's any help I can give, you've only to name it.' Leaving the letter aside, I promised Gandalf no less. 'Barley,' he says to me, 'this friend of mine from the Shire, he may be coming out this way before long, him and another. He'll be calling himself Underhill, mind that. But you need ask no questions, and if I'm not with him, he may be in trouble, and he may need help. Do whatever you can for him, and I'll be grateful,' he says. And here you are, and trouble is not far off, seemingly." "What do you mean?" said Frodo. "These black men," said the landlord, lowering his voice. "They're looking for Baggins, and if they mean well, then I'm a hobbit. It was on Monday, and all the dogs were yammering and the geese screaming. Uncanny, I called it Nob. He came and told me that 2 black men were at the door asking for a hobbit named called Baggins. Nob's hair was all stood on end. I bid the black fellows be off and slammed the door on them, but they've been asking the same question all the way to Archard, I hear. And that ranger Strider, he's been asking questions too. Tried to get in here to see you before you'd had a bite of sup, he did. He did, said Strider suddenly, coming forward into the light. And much trouble would have been saved if you had let him in, Barlaman. The landlord jumped with surprise. You, he cried, you're always popping up. What do you want now? He's here with my leave, said Frodo. He came to offer me his help. Well, you know your own business, maybe, said Mr. Butterbur, looking suspiciously at Strider. But if I was in your plight, I wouldn't take up with a ranger. Then who would you take up with? Asked Strider. A fat innkeeper who only remembers his own name because people shouted at him all day. They cannot stay in the pony forever, and they cannot go home. They have a long road before them. Will you go with me and keep the black men off? Me? Leave Bree? I wouldn't do that for any money, said Mr. Butterbur, looking really scared. But why can't you stay quiet here for a bit, Mr. Underhill? What are all these queer goings-ons? What are these black men after, and where do they come from, I'd like to know. I'm sorry, I can't explain it, answered Frodo. I'm tired, and I'm very worried, and it's a long tale. But if you mean to help me, I ought to warn you that you'll be in danger as long as I am in your house. These black riders, I am not sure, but I fear they come from... They come from Mordor, said Strider in a low voice. From Mordor, Barlaman, if that means anything to you. Save us, cried Mr. Butterbur, turning pale. The name evidently was known to him. That is the worst news that has come to Bree in my time. It is, said Frodo. Are you willing to help me? I am, said Mr. Butterbur. More than ever, though I don't know what the likes of me can do against... He faltered. Against the shadow in the east, said Strider quietly. Not much, Barlaman, but every little helps. You can let Mr. Underhill stay here tonight, as Mr. Underhill, and you can forget the name of Baggins till he is far away. I'll do that, said Butterbur. But they'll find out he's here without help from me, I'm afraid. It's a pity Mr. Baggins drew attention to himself this evening, to say no more. The story of that Mr. Bilbo going off has been heard before tonight in Bree. Even our Nob has been doing some guessing at his slow pate, and there are others in Bree quicker in the uptake than he is. Well, we can only hope the riders won't come back yet, said Frodo. I hope not indeed, said Butterbur, but spooks or no spooks, they won't get into the pony so easy. Don't you worry till the morning. Nob will say no word. No black men shall pass my doors while I stand on my legs. Me and my folk will keep watch tonight, but you had best get some sleep if you can. In any case, we must be called at dawn, said Frodo. We must get off as early as possible. Breakfast at 6:30, please. Right, I'll see to the orders, said the landlord. Good night, Mr. Baggins. Underhill, I should say. Good night now, bless me. Where's your Mr. Brandybuck? I don't know, said Frodo with sudden anxiety. They had forgotten all about Merry, and it was getting late. I am afraid he is out. He said something about going out for a fresh breath of Sorry about that. He said something about going for a breath of air. Well, you do want looking after, and no mistake. Your party might be on a holiday, said Mr. Butterbur. I must go and bar the doors quick, but I'll see your friend is let in when he comes. I'd better send Nob to look for him. Good night to you all. At last Mr. Butterbur went out, with another doubtful look at Strider and a shake of his head. His footsteps retreated down the passage. Well, said Strider, when are you going to open that letter? Frodo looked carefully at the seal before he broke it. It seemed certainly to be Gandalf's. Inside, written in the wizard's strong but graceful script, was the following message. The Prancing Pony, Bree, Mid-Year's Day, Shire Year 1418. Dear Frodo, bad news has reached me here. I must go off at once. You had better leave Bag End soon and get out of the Shire before the end of July at latest. I will return as soon as I can, and I will follow you if I find that you are gone. Leave a message for me here if you pass through Bree. You can trust the landlord, Butterbur. You may meet a friend of mine on the road, a man, lean, dark, tall, by some called Strider. He knows our business, and will help you. Make for Rivendell. There I hope we may meet again. If I do not come, Elrond will advise you. Yours in haste, Gandalf. P.S. Do not use it again. Not for any reason whatever. Do not travel by night. P.P.S. Make sure that it is the real Strider. There are many strange men on the roads. His true name is Aragorn. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old thing is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be the blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. PPPS. I hope Butterbur sends this promptly. A worthy man, but his memory is like a lumber room. Thing wanted, always buried. If he forgets, I shall roast him. Farewell. Okay. So I wanted to get the letter in there in a bit of stride. That's not actually the first time they speak with him, but it is in that chapter. A few notes here that I want to talk about in this section. You notice it can be kind of off-putting in our modern time to hear this about black men. They're talking about their clothes. The Nazgul, the ring wraiths. They are men, but they are also wraiths. So of course, neither Frodo nor Butterbur know this at this time. They just think of them as these dark figures. The Black Riders, referred to many times as black men. It can be kind of off-putting to hear Barlaman say, no black man will enter my establishment, and it's not a racist thing at all. They're not talking about skin color or anything like that. They're talking about the clothing, the Black Riders being completely hooded and cloaked, all in black. Even the horses were black. They took the black horses they stole them from Rohan and brought them to Mordor and trained them to bear the Nazgul. And you hear about this a lot. And Merry is out. Merry actually gets into a bit of trouble out there. The letter is interesting, of course. That was the main thing that I wanted in there. It has that poem in there, which we later learn was actually written by Bilbo. It is about Aragorn, but it was actually written by Bilbo, which is very interesting. Another thing that I want to mention is, many people that I know that have read The Lord of the Rings, including my own mother, who got me into this so many years ago when she gave me a copy of The Hobbit and then later The Lord of the Rings, said that she seemed to remember that he was Strider for a really long time before finding out that he was Aragorn. And it's like right there in the chapter that he's introduced that his true name is Aragorn. It is true that because he is introduced to the hobbits as Strider, they do tend to call him that quite a lot, although that falls by the wayside as he's not traveling with hobbits afterwards. Of course, Frodo and Sam go off to Mordor alone. Merry and Pippin are captured by orcs, and he's mainly traveling with Gimli and Legolas and, of course, Gandalf as well, when he's Gandalf the White. So that's also really interesting. And as a matter of fact, the name Aragorn comes up in the text far before the name Strider. He's mentioned in the chapter A Shadow of the Past when Gandalf speaks about tracking Gollum and how Gollum was found. And at one point he says that his friend Aragorn was the one who caught Gollum. What's interesting, though, is that, it has been some time, some months, and Frodo's been through a lot, but Frodo doesn't make that connection that Gandalf had mentioned the name Aragorn earlier, so he doesn't really think of that very much. There was one other thing, but I am afraid to say that it has quite gone out of my head as I was talking about everything else, but I think we covered most of the important things in that passage there. The G rune shows up a lot in Gandalf's letter. You can see a large one right there, and there's several more wherever he signs his name. That is the runic letter G. And if you're a member on the channel, and consider membership if you enjoy the content, you get a little G rune on your profile picture. That was the other thing I wanted to mention. Anyway, we do have 14 questions to get through today, so we're going to get to them. We're going to start with your first question. Our first question is interesting because it is actually not about The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or even the Silmarillion, although partly. It's about the Children of Húrin, which is actually my favorite of Tolkien's novels. How exactly did Túrin's curse work? Did he have any chance of escaping it, or was everything he went through inevitable? So the curse may not have been actually real, if you could believe it. It is believed that Túrin had a curse on him, as well as his sister, due to the fact that Morgoth said so. Morgoth told Húrin that he was going to curse his family. However, Morgoth also told Húrin that he was God, and that he created the world, and that there is nothing beyond the circles of the world, nor is there anything beyond death. Which we know all of that is not true. So in other words, Morgoth is a liar. From the perspective of Húrin, his children certainly seem to be under a curse. But Húrin was not shown everything. He was shown the bad things that happened to Túrin, but not the actions that Túrin partook in that caused these bad things to happen. One such example is that Húrin knew that a petty dwarf named Mim betrayed Túrin, but he did not know the context that Mim's life had been ransomed by Túrin and his outlaws, and that they had been responsible for the death of Mim's son. Túrin certainly believed that he was cursed, and he was the sort of person that would blame everyone else and everything else for his misfortunes, as it were. The elves believed that he was cursed, but so much of it was either caused by Túrin, or Morgoth was pulling the strings through his agent Glaurung, the dragon, the father of all dragons. The biggest argument against the curse being real is that Morgoth could do such a thing. If he could do that, if he could just cast a curse on an entire family from a distance, that would completely ruin their lives. Why wouldn't he just do that all the time? Why not do it to Thingol or do it to Turgon? Why not curse anyone and everyone that he doesn't like? Morgoth was angry, and he wanted Húrin to suffer, so he played a long and sick game with him. It wasn't long from Morgoth's perspective, but it was long from Húrin's perspective, and I think Morgoth knew that. And it was all because Húrin called him Morgoth to his face. The curse may have been a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if Túrin had a chance of escaping it, and this was mentioned in the Children of Húrin, it would have been via love, which he could have found with Finduilis. But once again, Morgoth, through Glaurung, intervened, stopping Túrin from saving her by convincing him that if he did, he would never see his sister again. So he traveled to Hithlum looking for his sister, and Finduilis got nailed to a tree by orcs, and she died. And she wound up in the West, of course, after that, because she was an elf. And what's interesting about Finduilis as a character is that she had previously been betrothed to an elf named Gwyndor, who had been captured and tortured by Morgoth, and he had been partially, I would say, faded, really. He was scarred and withered, and he had become old when elves don't normally become old unless they're very, very, very old, like Círdan, and had spent all of that time in Middle-earth, where the taint of Morgoth, or Melkor, as it were, is. So basically what happened to Círdan over many, many years happened to Gwyndor very quickly. And of course he also, like I said, was scarred, at least according to some of the drafts of the work, from being tortured by Morgoth. And he was barely recognizable. And you would think that the elves don't really care about these sort of things. If they're soulmates, they're soulmates. They don't care what a person looks like. It's actually not the truth. I mean, they were hunting dwarves at one point simply because they thought the dwarves were ugly, and they did not understand that they were living beings with voices. So yeah, sometimes the elves could actually be rather superficial like that. They weren't always perfect people, and if you're reading the Silmarillion or any of its satellite stories, you of course know that the elves are not perfect. They're not always great. But yeah, Finduilis was sort of falling for Túrin, and what's interesting is that Gwyndor was actually encouraging this. He wanted Finduilis, who was supposed to be his wife, to marry Túrin and to fall in love with him, to save him from Morgoth. Now, would the curse really be broken by love if it was real? I would say probably not, but I would say that if he had a good wife like Finduilis who really loved him, he would probably not take so many of the actions that he took that caused his life to continually get worse. Of course, Morgoth would have found other ways to mess with him, because that's what Morgoth does. He would have found other ways to make him miserable and It still would have been bad, is what I'm saying. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Lewis Matthews, who asks, if for some reason the fight hadn't happened on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, would the Balrog have ventured outdoors to pursue the Fellowship? Yes, absolutely. That is why Gandalf stayed and fought instead of trying to run with them. Balrogs are actually really insanely fast. They were able to travel from the pits of Angband across Hithlum and to Lambeth to assist Morgoth against Ungoliant. No one has ever outrun a Balrog. He knew, of course, that above all else, both Frodo and Aragorn must escape. The only way that this could happen is if he jammed up the Balrog. And he tried to do it without fighting it. He tried to just drop it into the pit, and then he would have been able to go, but the Balrog managed to snag him and drag him down. The fact that the Balrog went outside after escaping from Gandalf proves that it wasn't against the idea of going outside, but it needed sufficient motivation to do so. And the fact that Gandalf had tried to bury it under rubble, that was enough. It was angry. So if Gandalf hadn't stopped to fight it, and they just ran out, the Balrog would have followed them. It was very, very upset at that point. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Matthew Culbertson, who asks, were there already orcs at Isengard before Saruman battled Gandalf? Well, Saruman and Gandalf never battled, so let's get that out of the way. And yes, there had been orcs there for quite some time. The movies have a few things to answer for. In the book, there was never a battle between Saruman and Gandalf. There also was absolutely already orcs there in Isengard. The movie made it seem like Saruman called Sauron his master, which is ridiculous, and that Sauron asked him to build him an army worthy of Mordor. Then, in the span of just a few days, at least that's what it seemed like, Saruman spawns this huge army, mostly because it seems that in the films, the Uruk-hai, the Goblin Men, are born from the earth out of these like muddy egg sacs, fully grown. In the books, orcs produce sexually, like most creatures, and they are not born as adults. Saruman had been breeding them for quite some time, and we see part of his breeding stock in Bree, these half-orc men that were described as these shifty Southrons that Frodo saw in The Prancing Pony and just milling around in town, who later also appear in the Shire. Sauron had been building up his army for quite some time, and it wasn't to serve Sauron, but to hopefully impress Sauron into trusting the wizard who would later betray him. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Daniel Cuneo, and this one I feel got rather contentious. It shouldn't have. There should be no arguments whatsoever about this subject, but there were. So here's the question. Why, when he had lost possession of the ring, didn't the centuries it had extended Gollum's life not quickly catch up to him, like it did with Bilbo, and turn poor Smeagol into a dusty hobbit-sized bag of bones? Probably because no such thing happened to Bilbo. Tolkien never wrote anything that described Bilbo as rapidly aging after the destruction of the One Ring, nor did he write anything suggesting that Bilbo aged rapidly after giving up the ring. After the destruction of the One Ring, Bilbo does come off as rather senile, especially when he's traveling to the Grey Havens. This is to be expected. Bilbo was 131 years old, and he felt every bit that old in his mind, if not in his body. At the age of 111, Bilbo was physically, he appeared to be 50 years old, but so when he meets Frodo at Rivendell, he's 128 years old, and then he's 131 years old when he sails to the west, which would mean that physically, at that point, he would look to be nearing 80 years old. Gollum was nearly 600 years old when he died, and he was quite insane from centuries of solitude. He also was, to be quite honest, quite senile himself. He barely remembered who he was. He also had a split personality and a host of other issues. He did not age in the sense during his long possession of the One Ring, but he did change physically, adapting to his surroundings. He had the ring a lot longer than Bilbo had, and he was a much nastier creature, and that does matter. Like Bilbo, his aging would resume normally from where it left off after losing the ring, though we don't know how old he was when he first came into possession of the One Ring. I don't imagine that he was all that old. He still had a living grandmother, for example. Now, some people wanted to argue that Arwen said in The Return of the King that Bilbo was ancient, and that this is an indicator that he had aged rapidly. And that's not the case. Arwen said he was ancient because he was ancient. The exact word she used was ancient for his kind. And he was ancient for his kind. Hobbits normally live to be about 100 years old, give or take, and he's 3 decades past that. So that being said, she's not saying anything out of the ordinary. He is not willing to make the voyage down to Gondor for the royal coronation and the wedding, and she mentions he only has one journey left in him, of course, to the west. This is not an indicator that he has aged rapidly since the destruction of the ring, or since giving up the ring, which was what the question actually asked, but an indicator that he is feeling his age. And I had a really, I want to say, infuriating commentary back and forth with this fool of a took in the comments, not here on YouTube, but on Quora, who said, sort of repeating the same talking point. And I said, when Bilbo was 111 at his birthday party, he already felt old and tired. He felt those years, even though he didn't look them. And this person said, he never said that. He just said he felt stretched out. And I had to bring out the actual passage. The first thing he says, I am old, Gandalf. I may not look it, but I feel it in my heart of hearts. Well preserved indeed. I feel all thin and stretched like butter scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a holiday. That was the actual quote. The fact that I was able to do that from memory, I hope I didn't screw it up, but I think that was at least mostly right. He did say that he felt old. He did not say that, so that was a rather interesting comment that I had gotten. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Who were Aragorn's parents in The Lord of the Rings? That would be Arathorn II, and Gilraen was his mother's name. Arathorn II was Aragorn's father, and he died when Aragorn was a boy. He was only 2 years old. He was brought by Gilraen to foster with Elrond, which isn't actually that unusual. Elrond traditionally did foster the boys who had become the chieftains of the Dunedain. However, because Aragorn had lost his father, Elrond essentially adopted him. So Gilraen and Elrond raised him. He was called Estel until he was about 20 years old because they didn't want to reveal his true name or his heritage, not only to him, but to really anybody who might hear. So it wasn't until he turned 20 that they told him that, and that's when he got the shards of Narsil and such. And before the follow-up question comes through, no, Aragorn's mother was not alive during the time of The Lord of the Rings. She had passed away. She was alive when he was 20, and there's a conversation between Aragorn and his mother in the appendix of The Lord of the Rings, The Tale of Aragorn and Arwen. So there is that, if you're interested in what little we know about Gilraen. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This question comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, did Ulmo assist Eru in a task to sink Númenor? No, Eru Ilúvatar did that on his own. Ilúvatar would certainly need no assistance from Ulmo or any of the Valar for sinking Númenor. As a matter of fact, Ilúvatar's feat was far greater than merely sinking this this little continent, this island nation, he broke the world and reshaped it. The world was flat, like this, and he broke it and made it into a sphere. And aside from that, he also sundered the Undying Lands, Aemon and Eressëa, containing Valinor and Eldamar and many other lands. And in doing so, this also destroyed Númenor. Many lands that existed ceased to exist due to this event, which was called the Akalabath, which means the downfall. And some new lands came into being because of this. It wasn't just sinking the island, in other words. Ulmo could have done that himself. He didn't, need Ilúvatar to do that. Or Ulmo didn't even need to do it himself. He could have delegated this to Osse. Osse was the one who raised Númenor up from the seabed. So if he could raise it, he could bring it down himself. The fact is, though, that such a thing was in the power of the Valar, but not in their authority. Which is why, once Pharazôn stepped onto the Undying Lands and declared the land his own, Manwë called Ilúvatar to deal with it. At that point, the Valar laid down their stewardship over the world, and they let the big man upstairs, take over for a moment, and that's why that happened. It wasn't that they couldn't do that through lack of ability, but that they didn't have the authority to do that. And to be quite honest, they didn't want to destroy Númenor. This is what happens when Ilúvatar is asked to step in. If Manwë could have spoken to Pharazôn face to face before he had come to Aemon, perhaps through Palantir or something, he would have said, "Don't do this, because if you do this, I will be forced to lay down my kingship of the world and call the One." And you really don't want that to happen, because it's going to be so much worse. Okay, next question. Here's the question from the thumbnail that came in from Louis Matthews, who asks, or maybe it's Lewis, when elves are reincarnated, are they born as babies or brought back as they were? They are brought back as they are, more or less. When an elf's body is slain, or perishes out of waste of grief, or perhaps they took their own life, their souls are sent to Mandos. They can be there for a time if the guardian of Mandos, the Vala, who is actually called Namo, though the elves typically call him Mandos, if he decides to keep them there, they will stay there. But otherwise, they will be reincarnated. Now, if their body is in good shape, like an example being Muriel, they can just return to their own body. Though Muriel elected to stay in Mandos, her body was brought to Lorien and kept preserved. As it was the Undying Land, her body did not wither, and when she finally decided to leave Mandos, she returned to that same body. If the elf's body is damaged, like, for example, the elves that were slain in the first kinslaying, then Manwë can either wither their bodies fully, and then a new one is made, a process that seems to take a few years, or he could heal their body. If they die in Middle-earth, they must wait for their body to completely wither away into nothing before they get a new one. And this is said to happen rather quickly. I don't know how quickly means quickly. I think when Tolkien said it happens quickly in Middle-earth to elves, I think he was saying in relation to how fast a man's body may wither, the elf's body would wither faster. That's not to say that it's instant. The bodies are described as being exactly the same as the previous ones, so I'm unsure if this would include things like scars or missing limbs, however, but they do get brand new bodies. But we do know that even people who die in Middle-earth, Manwë can heal them enough. Or I should say Ilúvatar can, because the example that I was going to use is Beorn and Gandalf as well. Beorn and Gandalf were both by divine intervention, so I can't even say Manwë. Manwë may be able to do that, but There's no examples of him doing it. It was definitely Ilúvatar, because Beren was mortal, and Gandalf was sort of a special occasion. And both of those involved Ilúvatar himself. Okay, next question. Why was Morgoth imprisoned in Valinor for his crimes against Arda, while Sauron was not? Did Sauron face any consequences for betraying the Valar or aiding Angband during their war with Eregion? Okay, so the last part's actually a little confusing, because Eregion and Angband didn't actually exist at the same time. But the reason that Melkor was imprisoned and Sauron was not is very easy to answer. Sauron wasn't caught. The Valar came to Middle-earth, and they battled Melkor, and they put him under siege when he fled into Autumno, and they hauled him back to the Undying Lands after Tulkas beat him up a bit, and they locked him in Mandos. It was mentioned that they did not plumb the depths of the tunnels beneath Autumno and Angband, and they did not find the Balrogs, and they did not find Sauron. Later, when he was defeated again, he was dragged back by Eonwe. Sauron did make an appearance this time, and he attempted to surrender himself. He took a fair form, and he renounced his evil ways. Eonwe trusted Sauron to do the right thing, because he was surrendering, and to everyone that witnessed this event, Sauron seemed very sincere. He was told to travel to Valinor and to surrender to Manwë, because Eonwe did not have the authority to pardon Sauron. Sauron was afraid, and he was full of pride. He stayed in Middle-earth, and he attempted to heal the land, trying to curry favor with the Valar through deeds. It didn't work, because he was already told the proper channel to go through, and he was ignoring that. And because he felt no sudden approval of the Valar, which we know is a thing, because Galadriel felt it. She said after she turned down the One Ring, she has passed the test. She will pass into the West and remain Galadriel. She knew that the ban on her had been lifted in that very moment. So he felt, or thought, I should say, that the Valar must have abandoned Middle-earth. They were no longer interested in what was happening over there, so that he had to be the hero. He had to save Middle-earth from chaos by bringing order, and through this he fell into evil a second time. Next question. Okay, this is an interesting question because of what happened. So I'm sorry I don't have the name of the person that requested it. This did come through as a request, and I answered it, and I typed up a whole thing, and, these things, they don't just happen, like, instantly. There's a little bit of research involved sometimes, although this was a pretty easy one. I have to get an image to use and everything, and by the time I hit submit on my answer, I got a very strange error message on Quora. It told me that the question had been deleted, which I thought, that's strange. Why would the person who wrote this question delete it? And I looked into it to try to find the name of the person that wrote it and maybe contact them and ask them why. And I saw that it wasn't deleted by that person, but actually was deleted by the Quora moderation team, specifically a sort of a bot, I would say, that's supposed to clean up spaces and remove things from spaces. And this was originally posted in my space, the Grey Havens. And I thought that was strange because there's a completely innocuous question. And I didn't think there was anything wrong with the question. Certainly they weren't disputing my answer because I never got to submit it. So I thought it was strange. I don't know why the question was deleted. It was not my doing. Like I said, it was something that Quora did. And I spoke to my friend Alice, who is a moderator on the Grey Havens, as well as my Discord community. And I said, this is very strange. And they think that it might have been like just some AI gone wrong here. But because I went through the effort of answering the question, I said to Alice, will you rewrite the question and submit it to me again so that I can publish the answer? So I'm sorry that I don't have the name of the person who originally requested it. It does come in by request of Alice Stone. now, but that's because I asked Alice to do that. Were the Valar aware that Annatar was actually Sauron, and if so, why did they fail to alert the elves? So if they were aware, it didn't matter. The Valar are in the Undying Lands across the ocean. They are not there to see what Sauron is up to. Now, it is true that from the peak of Taniquetil, Manwë can see everything in the world. However, this does not mean that he hears everything or that he knows the context of what he sees. The last time, and I should also mention, just because he can see everything doesn't mean that he does see everything. He's not omnipotent. He can only look at one thing at a time, much as you and me can only really look at one thing at a time. You can look in one direction. You can't see what's behind you. But maybe you can with a mirror, but then you're looking in the mirror and you're not really seeing what's in front of you. So nobody can see everything, even if you physically have the ability to see everything from from the world being flat and you're on the tallest peak and you just have supernatural vision. That doesn't mean that you're looking everywhere. So the last time anyone associated with the Valar saw Sauron, it was Ianwa, and we just talked about this. Sauron was attempting to surrender himself for pardon. Ianwa told him about the proper channels to go through. Sauron did not do this. He tried to make amends by healing the lands during the early Second Age. Now, eventually he did lapse back into evil, as I said, and him going to Eregion in disguise and giving them the ability to create rings of power was his evil plan. But do the Valar know that? Does Manwë know that? We're going to get into that in a second. But I just wanted to put that out there as a question for you to just sort of chew on a little bit. Just food for your mind to chew on. As far as the Valar know, he's supposedly trying to do good deeds, and here he is with the elves teaching them things. So from this perspective, they would have very little reason for concern. In fact, if they knew that Annatar was Sauron, which is a big maybe, I would say probably not, actually. It is possible that Círdan may have contacted Eressëa via Palantir, because he had one of them, and there was the Master Stone in Eressëa. And he may have told the elves that there was someone named Annatar that came to Lindon, and that Gil-galad and Elrond turned him away. This doesn't give the Valar major concerns, but when he went to Mordor and created the One Ring, suddenly they were very concerned. And that was the same year that they sent the Blue Wizards, and likely Glorfindel as well, to Middle-earth. So they were watching, and they were waiting, and they were seeing, but it wasn't until Sauron did something that was obviously evil that they took action. Okay, next question. Here's one that came in by the request of Jeffrey Clavern. And I found this to be a fun question. Not every question has to be so amazing. Sometimes they can just be fun. When does Aragorn get angry in The Lord of the Rings? So Aragorn has a pretty long temper. We never really see him lose it. Aragorn sometimes speaks sharply when he needs to. Sometimes he gets a bit annoyed, like with Barlam and Butterbur, when he suggests that Strider is not to be trusted. Earlier in the video I read that passage. Or with Boromir, whenever Boromir says something ignorant. But he doesn't really come off as angry, just annoyed. Even giving Frodo a sharp reclamation for revealing that Galadriel has one of the Rings of Power, it doesn't come off that harsh. Another example is that he gets very fed up with Gimli and Legolas bickering. But he comes off much less angry in the situation than, say, Gandalf would have. Gandalf was pretty quick to lose his temper. In this situation, Gandalf came off almost as the parent who says, "Enough, here's what we're doing," and just sort of decisively ends the argument without getting angry. Aragorn was raised, as I mentioned earlier, by the incredibly even-tempered Elrond, so it's honestly no surprise that he keeps his cool throughout the story. Now, one person in the comments mentioned that, maybe when he found Merry and Pippin and thought, that they had been murdered in the battle against the Rohirrim, but that, as somebody else who answered pointed out, that's not really rage, that's anguish, He was very upset, as were Gimli and Legolas, but also he still had hope that they could be alive, so yeah. And another person, Nick in the comments says, he's 87 years old. He has the patience of an old man dealing with the overeager but well-meaning young man. And I think there's something to that as well, although Gandalf is much, much older, and he's pretty short-tempered at times, so there's that as well. Like I said, just a fun question. Okay, next one. Here's an interesting question. If Balin and his colony occupied Moria for 5 years, how come they never encountered the Balrog? Moria is big. The chances of running into the Balrog are actually pretty low. Gollum had been living in Moria for quite some time at that point. Gandalf and Aragorn had both traveled through Moria in the past, and they didn't run into the Balrog either. However, the Fellowship did, which could be attributed to, a few of these reasons here. For example, the Fellowship were not being quiet, and they were not being stealthy. A big deal was made out of Pippin tossing a rock into a hole, and then they heard hammers after this, but even after this, they didn't try to be stealthy. Gandalf was annoyed, but he was annoyed because Pippin was breaking his concentration. Gandalf was lost, and he was trying to think, and Pippin made a big noise and sort of rattled him. After they figured out where they're going, they went into a chamber, and Gimli sang a really loud song, and it echoed throughout the chamber. So they weren't even trying to be quiet after hearing the hammers. A large portion of Sauron's power was being carried through the city. The One Ring, of course. Now, I don't agree with some people that say the Balrog was attracted specifically to the One Ring, but I do think the presence of such power, as well as Gandalf being there as well, that would have him on edge, I think. And most of all, though, if Balin and his crew did encounter the Balrog, that would have been the end of them right there, and no one would know of it. The journal, the book of Azurnable, it ends with them being overtaken. If the Balrog was upon them, it's not like the scribes could just run back to the book and write, OMG, there's a Balrog, And even if they did have the ability to do that, they don't know what a Balrog is. Dane was the only dwarf to see the Balrog and survive, and he called it Durin's Bane, but he didn't know it was a Balrog. Of course, Gimli would know too, but that's only because Legolas told him it was a Balrog. Okay, next question. Here is an interesting question that came in from Andrew Brigmond, and I think it's interesting because it's linguistic related. Although it's difficult to convey this question through speech instead of having it written. But the question is, are the Beornings descendants of the House of Bëor? So it's an intriguing question, and I would say no. No, they're absolutely not. Though from a glance, the question here suggests a connection based on linguistics between Beor, B-E-O-R, and Bjorn, B-E-O-R-N. Really just an N added to the end, right? There's a bit more of a difference, though. The names aren't pronounced in a similar way. So the House of Bëor, it's actually spelled like I'm going to put it on the screen here. Notice the two little dots over the E. It's pronounced Bëor. It's a name that was given to him by the elves, and it means vassal. His actual name, what he was called by his parents, was Balin, but he took the title Bëor, and his house became named after that. In the Third Age, the descendants of the House of Bëor would actually be the House of Elrond. There aren't even that many generations between Bëor and Elrond. If we go from father to son, we would have Bëor had a son Baron, Baron had a son named Boron, Boron had a son named Beren, Beren had a son named Dior. And then we have to switch to the female line because Dior didn't have any sons, but he had a daughter named Elwing. And Elwing had two sons, Elrond and Elros. So through Elrond, we of course get Elladan, Elrohir, Arwen, and through Elros we get all of the Sea Kings of old, all the way down to Aragorn II. Bjorn, on the other hand, doesn't have that E with the 2 dots above it, and it's pronounced like I've been saying it, Bjorn. It's actually an Old English word that is derived from an Old Norse Bjorn, where the E is actually a J, and it means bear. But it can also mean warrior, and more poetically, it can mean man. And it's sort of the perfect name because he is a man, he is a warrior, and he is a bear because he's a skin changer. The similar spelling is actually a coincidence. The name being represented as Old English in the text suggests an Eotheod origin, because Old English in the text represents Rohanese. The Rohirrim once were the Eotheod, and they lived in the north before they were given a part of Gondor, and their dwelling was in the same region that Bjorn occupies. So he probably was named in a similar manner to the name the men of Rovanion that had migrated to the south, which would mean that he's less related to somebody like Elrond or Aragorn and more related to someone like Theoden, actually. Interesting question, though. Okay, next question. In The Lord of the Rings, if Gandalf cannot be killed or harmed easily, what would happen to him if he jumped off the Tower of Isengard and attempted to land on the ground below and then run away, knowing he would survive the jump alive easily? Well, oh, this is a fun one because I get to use this clip. I don't know where you got the idea that Gandalf can't be killed or harmed easily. Let's answer the question first, though. What would happen if Gandalf the Grey jumped off of Orthanc?
The same thing that happens to everything else.
Yeah. Gandalf isn't invincible. He's tougher than you might expect, but he is an incarnate nonetheless, and with that comes the same frailties that any other incarnate has. He's probably tougher than a mortal, or on par with an elf, but he's also in an aged body. He gets tired, he gets hungry, he feels pain and cold. He broke his arm, or at least had some sort of injury that would require a sling in The Hobbit in the Battle of Five Armies. Probably not a broken arm, because he seemed to recover from it rather quickly, or maybe Elrond healed him. But he survived being tossed down a long stairway by the Balrog's counterspell, but he did say that nearly killed him. Gandalf the White is a lot tougher. He mentions that the weapons of the hunters couldn't harm him, and this includes the Sword of Elendil, which had a hand in killing one of Sauron's incarnations. However, this does not, and by the way, just because I use the word incarnation does not mean that Sauron was an incarnate. One of his manifestations, I should say. However, this doesn't mean that he would survive a drop off of such a large tower onto the rocks below. Even if he did survive, he'd probably break his legs or something. He wouldn't be able to run away so quickly, and Saruman would just have him captured again. And also, I should mention, and this is important, I didn't even mention this on Quora, but I'm mentioning it now. The gates were barred. As soon as Gandalf went into the circle of Isengard, the gates shut behind him, and he wasn't going to be able to magic those open all that easily. He escaped because he flew. He was on the back of an eagle. So, yeah, there was really no other way out. Okay, and now we come to our last question. As of 2024, are there any J.R.R. Tolkien literary works of his writing still to be published? Probably. The Fall of Númenor was only released a short time, like a year and a half ago, and everybody thought that The Nature of Middle-earth was the final book, and before that they thought The Fall of Gondolin was the final book, and so on. Every time a new Tolkien book comes out, they think, well, this is the last one, there's not going to be another one. Now, The Fall of Númenor doesn't actually contain any new material. Everything in it had been published already, though some of the prior publications were rather obscure. But The Nature of Middle-earth was mostly very new. Tolkien wrote a lot of drafts, and there's a lot of unfinished scripts and notes. The biggest hurdle is that a lot of his writing was by hand, and a lot of it wasn't legible. And with his son having passed away, the one person who was the best at discerning Tolkien's handwriting is gone. However, there probably is more to come, even if it's not Legendarium related. So, anyway, that's all the questions we have for today. Leave me some questions. If you have a question for me, you can just go ahead and leave it right in the comments section, and I'll answer it. If you want to be featured in a video, or I should say have a shot at being featured in a video, or if you just think your question is too it's complex to be answered simply in a comment, you can go to my Quora. There is a link to my Quora account in the description. Ask me on there, or if you just go on Quora and ask anything Tolkien related. After you ask the question, there's going to be a list of people that you can tag. My name is going to be at or near the top of that list, so just tag me in that, and I'll try to get back to you. Sometimes I don't answer questions, and it's not because I think your question is bad, but sometimes several people will ask basically the same thing, and instead of just pasting it to different people, I'll just answer it once. So, you could look through the Grey Havens. There's a link to that in my description as well, and you can see, like, basically all of my answers are on there. I'm not the only one who posts on the Grey Havens, but I am the administrator there, so everything that I write winds up on there. If you got to the end of the video and you haven't subscribed yet, please do. That really does help me out. Click the subscribe, the bell, share the video, all that good stuff. And if you want to help me out even more, consider membership. Membership gives you quite a few perks, including emotes, and you get a cool little, as I mentioned earlier, the Gandalf rune on your profile picture whenever you leave a comment here, and you get to see all the videos early, and I'm talking at least a week early. 7 days at the minimum, sometimes even longer than that, and that's kind of a big deal. And of course, you could even leave comments on those videos early. Anyway, I will see you guys next time.